Take a breath with me. In and out. Now imagine this. A land where the sky smells of sugar and ash, where the rivers carry whispers of prayers that were never answered, where men built their fortunes not with hands, but with chains. This was São Paulo, 1872, the heart of Brazil's empire of coffee and cane. The Valley of Paraíba, a place so fertile it fed nations, and yet it was soaked with blood. Here, the masters lived in great houses that glowed under oil lamps and gold. They called them Casa Grande, the big house, but to those who lived beneath its shadow, it was another name for hell. Listen closely. You could almost hear it, the rhythmic thud of the sugar mill, the iron grinding through the night. Every beat was a command, every silence a threat, every sunrise another sentence. They said the colonel who ruled over this valley was a man of God. He wore white linen and quoted scripture between sips of imported wine. His name was Coronel Antonio de Sabareto, though most never dared to speak it aloud. To the enslaved, he was simply the mouth of iron, a man whose smile had the cruelty of a blade. He owned more than land. He owned fear. And in the year 1872, fear ruled every breath in that valley. Picture the nights, humid and heavy, the kind that made candles cry and tempers rot. In the fields, the enslaved worked under the moon because the sun had already broken them. Hands split, back scarred, bones trembling with exhaustion. But worse than pain was the silence, the kind of silence that hums before a storm. And that storm had a name too, justice, though no one dared to call it that yet. They say it began with 30 souls who had lost everything except rage. Men and women stripped of family, language, and time, yet still carrying one thing the colonel could not crush, the memory of freedom. In whispers, they spoke of it. In songs, they disguised it. And in glances, they shared it. But the colonel saw what silence could hide. He felt the tension in the air, like smoke before fire. So he decided to act first, to remind the valley who held the power of life and death. One morning, under a sky bruised with heat, the colonel called 30 of them to the yard. He said it was for discipline. He said it was for order. He said it was for God. The priest blessed the water. The overseers loaded their rifles. And one by one, 30 bodies fell to red earth, a sacrifice made not a heaven, but an empire. By sunset, the valley was silent again, but it was not the silence of peace. It was a silence that waits, the silence that counts the hours until vengeance. Pause with me here. Close your eyes. Imagine that kind of silence, the kind that lives inside people who have nothing left to lose. Because that is where the story begins, not with fire, not with swords, but with the sound of breathing in the dark. That night, the colonel feasted. He dined on roast pork and red wine, surrounded by his guests, planters, soldiers, and priests. They toasted order restored, to obedience renewed. They spoke of the emperor's grace, of God's divine law, of how the land must be ruled by discipline. And outside, in the distance, the earth trembled. The slaves who remained did not sleep. They gathered by the old sugar mill, where the blood of 30 still darkened the ground. No words were spoken, only the sound of steel, chains being broken, knives being sharpened. And from the fields, the fireflies seemed to gather, dozens of tiny lights flickering in the night, like spirits rising from the soil. Some say they heard drums that night, faint at first, then growing louder like the heartbeat of the land itself. Others swear there was no sound at all, just a wind that came from nowhere, carrying the smell of blood and salt. Whatever it was, something woke the colonel in his bed. He sat up, heart pounding, listening. Perhaps it was guilt, though men like him rarely felt it. Perhaps it was fear. Or perhaps it was the sound of justice, finally finding its way back through the dark. Because in the Valley of Paraíba, they say that night, the night after 30 souls were buried, the big house met hell. And hell didn't come from below. It came from the fields. It came from the earth. It came from the chains themselves. It started with rain. Not a storm. Not yet. Just slow, patient drops tapping against the roof tiles of the big house. The kind of rain that carries warning. The colonel lay in his bed, the sound of thunder distant, like footsteps in another world. Beside him, A silver crucifix caught a flash of lightning, and for a second, the room filled with the pale shimmer of heaven, the kind that offers no comfort to guilty men. Downstairs, the lamps flickered. A servant hurried to close the shutters, whispering a prayer under his breath. But prayers had stopped working in that house long ago. Outside, the rain turned red. Or maybe that was just a reflection of the torches, dozens of them moving slowly up the hill. The night hid their faces, but not their purpose. One of the overseers saw them first. He stepped out onto the veranda, rubbing his eyes, thinking it was a trick of the storm. Then he heard it, the sound of chains dragging through mud. Not one, but many, like a metallic river coming to life. He called out. No answer. He reached for his pistol, but by then it was too late. From the shadows came a figure, soaked, silent, eyes burning like coal. Behind him, others emerged, faces lit by the trembling light of fire and fury. The overseer tried to shout again, but the rain swallowed his voice. And then came the first sound of iron striking bone. A dull, final sound that echoed through the valley like a drumbeat from the underworld. Inside, the colonel heard it. He thought it was thunder. He turned over, muttering something about disobedience, about teaching them again. But the sound came again, closer this time. He rose, wrapped his robe around him, and stepped into the hallway. There at the far end stood the priest, the same man who had blessed the executions that morning. His face was pale, his hands trembling. "They're here," he whispered. The colonel frowned. "Who?" The priest's voice broke. "The dead." The door shattered before he could answer. A gust of wind burst from the corridor, carrying the smell of earth, smoke, and something else, something raw, like the scent of bodies not yet buried. The colonel stumbled back. In the doorway stood the field hands, drenched, silent, their eyes reflecting the flickering firelight like shards of glass. They carried no guns, only chains. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Rain dripped from the ceiling. A clock ticked somewhere behind them. The colonel opened his mouth, maybe to speak, maybe to pray. But the chains spoke first. They struck the marble floor with a sound that made the candles tremble. And then, all at once, the silence ended. The big house filled with the roar of rage that had waited centuries to be heard. Furniture splintered, glass shattered. The portraits of the masters, generations of cruelty painted in gold, crashed to the ground. The colonel tried to run. He slipped on the blood of his own guards. He screamed for mercy, for soldiers, for God. But no one came. The slaves, no, not slaves anymore, advanced to the corridors like a tide of ghosts made flesh. Their faces were not wild, not savage. They were calm, too calm, the kind of calm that only comes after pain has burned itself out. They caught him in the courtyard, beneath the statue of St. George, the saint who kills dragons. The irony was not lost on anyone. He fell to his knees, hands raised, mouth trembling. But mercy was a language that had long died in that house. The chains wrapped around his arms, his chest, his legs. Iron met flesh, and for the first time, the man who forged bondage felt his weight. He tried to shout orders, but his words drowned in rain and thunder. They dragged him through the mud, through the very fields where he had ordered others to crawl. His screams echoed down the valley, carried by the storm. Some said the earth itself shook that night, as if it had been waiting for this moment too. By dawn, the big house was gone. Nothing left but smoke, ashes, and bones. And somewhere in the still wet soil, the chains lay twisted, not broken, but transformed. Some said they found the colonel's body, torn and mangled beyond recognition. Others said there was nothing left at all, that the earth had swallowed him whole. The priest fled the valley and never spoke again. And those who survived told the story only in whispers. That night, the chains chose their master. When morning came, the valley looked like it had never belonged to the living. The air hung heavy with ash. The cane fields, once green and endless, now stretched black and broken, as if scorched by the breath of some ancient god. Smoke rose from the ruins of the big house in thin, crooked lines, the last prayers of a place that had forgotten what mercy was. The governor's men arrived by midday, soldiers on horseback, faces wrapped in cloth against the stench of burnt flesh. They rode in silence through the ruins, their boots crushing the wet soil where blood had turned to mud. The priest who had fled the night before waited for them near the chapel. He trembled as he spoke, his voice cracking between guilt and disbelief. "They killed him," he said. "They killed the colonel." One of the soldiers dismounted and looked around. "Where is he?" The priest pointed to the courtyard, but there was nothing there. Only the chains, tangled, rusted, darkened by something that wasn't just rain. They searched for hours. They found bones, yes, but no body, and that somehow frightened them more. The official report, written in perfect cursive, claimed that the slaves had burned the house, that the colonel had been executed by his own laborers, and that order had been restored. But outside those pages, the story took on a life of its own. The locals whispered that when the soldiers entered the ruins, the air turned cold, that they heard footsteps on the upper floor, even though there was no upper floor left, that at night, the chains moved on their own, dragging across the courtyard as if something unseen still struggled to rise. Some said the colonel was not devoured by men. They said the earth itself took him, pulled him down into the red soil he had stained with centuries of blood. Others said the enslaved didn't kill him out of vengeance, but out of duty, that the land had demanded balance, and they were only its hands. The empire wanted the story buried. The newspapers in Rio called it a regrettable uprising. The church called it divine punishment for disobedience. No one spoke the word justice, not once, but the people who lived near the valley began to avoid it. Farmers moved away. Children refused to play near the ruins. And travelers swore that on certain nights, when the moon hung red over the Paraíba River, you could hear the sound of iron dragging through the earth, slow, rhythmic, endless. The old priest died 3 years later. In his final confession, he spoke one sentence that the record keeper noted, trembling. "I saw him. He was not dead." By then, the story had already become myth. The colonel who was dragged by his own chains. A tale whispered by firelight, half warning, half curse. It became part of the land, woven into the soil, carried by the wind. Even those who didn't believe it could feel it, because in that valley, every link of iron, every scarred trunk, every rusted nail still hummed with the same question. Who truly owns the earth, the one who conquers it, or the one buried beneath it? Let that question settle, because this story, like the others we tell, was not only about what happened, it was about what keeps happening. The chains may have changed shape, now made of law, of silence, of memory erased, but they still cling to the world's conscience. Every act of cruelty, every life forgotten, leaves a weight that must go somewhere, and sometimes the world drags it back into the light. That night in 1872, when the big house met hell, wasn't just vengeance, it was balance, a brutal, inevitable balance. And in that balance, there is a truth we still struggle to face. The oppressed remember longer than the oppressors can sleep. Take a breath with me. In and out. Now close your eyes for a second and imagine the valley again, not as it was, but as it is now. Grass has grown over the ashes. The big house is gone, devoured by vines and time. The stones that once framed its walls now rest under moss, cracked and hollow, like ribs of a dead giant. But if you walk there at dusk, you'll feel it. The air still trembles, faint, electric, alive, as if the earth itself is whispering the name of those 30 souls who never left. Sometimes the past doesn't die. It just changes its voice. Locals say the rain still falls heavier over that soil, as if washing the memory again and again, trying to cleanse what can never be clean. Old farmers tell stories of hearing chains in the night, dragging not in pain, but in rhythm, like a song too old for words. And once, years later, a traveler wrote in his journal, "I slept near the ruins. At midnight, I woke to footsteps in the mud. I looked out and saw figures, not ghosts, not men, walking toward the river. Their feet made no sound. They were carrying something heavy, and in the moonlight, it shone like iron." He left the valley the next morning and never returned. Maybe it was imagination. Maybe it was memory. Maybe those two things are not so different after all, because history isn't buried. It breathes. It seeps through cracks in the ground, through psalms, through stories whispered by those who refuse to forget. And every time someone listens, really listens, the past exhales. So, what do we do with that breath? Do we run from it? Or do we let it remind us who we are? Think about this. For centuries, people like the Colonel believed they owned the world, the land, the labor, even the lives of others. But the night he was dragged by his own chains proved something terrifyingly simple. No one escapes what they create. Every cruelty leaves a mark. Every injustice leaves a sound. And every act of silence becomes a kind of prayer for reckoning. That night in São Paulo, 1872, wasn't about punishment. It was about the scales of the universe shifting back into place, violently, yes, but truthfully. The world, it seems, has its own way of keeping score. Now open your eyes. Look around you. The chains are different, but they're still here. Some made of poverty, some of prejudice, some of ignorance, and yet, so are the hands that can break them. Maybe that's what these stories are for. Not to horrify, not to entertain, but to remind us that fire can be born even in darkness. That history, no matter how brutal, carries within it the seeds of defiance. And that somewhere in the ashes, there's always someone willing to pull the first link apart. So when you hear of valleys, of houses, of forgotten graves, remember the weight of the silence beneath them, because silence, too, has chains. And the only way to break them is to speak. Take one last breath with me. In and out. Now listen, really listen. Can you hear it? That faint sound beneath the world? That's not the wind. That's memory. And memory never forgets. Every chain tells a story. Some of them are still waiting to be heard. Subscribe and let history speak again.